risk factors for PTSD, what are the big ones we should be on the lookout for?
I think some of the biggest ones are experiencing repeated, frequent trauma. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what career where someone might see that stuff all over and over again.
Trauma therapists.
Trauma therapists. Yeah, you just called me out.
Oh, crap.
Yeah, first responders, trauma therapists, right? So again, seeing things over and over again, being exposed.
Repeat exposure.
Seeing it, learning about it, or experiencing it yourself. Over and over again is a risk factor, obviously. The more it happens, the more that's poured into that cup, the more likely it's going to overflow eventually. Stuffing emotions, something I'm really good at. I think a lot of us are. The more you stuff your emotions, the higher likelihood that you're going to develop PTSD. Because again, like you said earlier, you're not working on it. We're not treating that injury, right? Minimal ability to manage emotions, right? How many of us are taught? When did you guys take a class in school to learn how to manage your emotions, right? So let's take the shame away from it. Most of us weren't taught, but that's actually a risk factor when we don't know how to manage or move through our emotions on our own.
There's a fancy word called alexithymia.
Yes.
Which basically just means an inability to label my emotions, where I just kind of lump them all together into like good or bad, right? And that is a major risk factor as well. So as we move towards understanding how to deal with this stuff, being more aware of my emotions, being able to label them, understand why they're there, that's an important piece of the puzzle when doing treatment for these things. So
emotional intelligence, right?
Exactly. And as we look at these risk factors, just recognizing that as you look at yourself, you start to recognize some of these risk factors or some of these symptoms in yourself, there is, like he said earlier, there's hope, but what's really important to understand is that it's not just that there's hope, it's that we are very good at treating this now. Not necessarily we First Watch, but we in general, human beings. Like we have become experts at understanding what trauma is, how it works, what treatments work, and that's why we know this stuff. That's why we've got these risk factors down to a freaking science. And we can say, hey, these are the things that are most likely to create these symptoms. If you've got this stuff and you're not experiencing some of the extremity of these symptoms, yet you have some of these risk factors, getting help is just as important for you as it is for somebody else who's got the extremity, the really high severity of some of these symptoms. Waiting a long time and waiting for things to get really, really bad is probably the biggest risk factor there is. What did you say?
Oh, totally.
Yeah, the avoidance stuff is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, injury, whatever you want to call it, right? But in reality, what I was taught as a young kid was, emotions are meant to be stored away, left for another day.
Or even emotions are weak.
Weak.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I shove them down, stuff them down, and they're sitting in my body just waiting to explode. And then when they do come out, they're big. Learning how to deal with that feeling of the big emotions is much more, doable. I don't want to say fun, but I'm gonna say fun because it's kind of cool to do, right? To learn how to do those things.
It's a whole new world if you haven't experienced it.
But if I don't, I'm going to rely on other things that are going to push down some of these symptoms. And probably the biggest risk factor on here is avoidance, but really specifically, it's working. I'm going to outwork this thing. Yeah. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to get it understood. And as soon as I get it, I'm going to outwork it.
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Or, I'm going to work so much that I don't have thoughts.
Yeah.
And then when you get home, that switch stays on and boom, all of them come back, right? Yeah. It's too much. I have to mention one more.
Please, other risk
factor. And this one, some of you might not like. A lot of times I get guys and gals who are avoidant of talking about this. But I see this all the time, that many first responders go into the field for a reason. Mm-hmm. And that's because in childhood, there's that word, childhood, they've experienced painful experiences, trauma, that now they want to give back, right? I want to make sure that people don't experience what I did. But having childhood trauma is a risk factor for PTSD, especially if you go into the field. And I see this all the time. Many guys and gals have a history of childhood trauma. That again, it's the size of the cup, right? So going back to my analogy earlier, some of us are born with a little bit bigger cups than others on how we can handle it. Childhood trauma makes the cup smaller, in a way, and so again, it's going to overflow.
A risk factor that is important to mention as well in developing post-traumatic stress and just mental illness in general is poverty.
Yeah,
and that's
a big one.
generational. And so if you grew up in an impoverished situation, the likelihood that you will, have addiction later in life, the likelihood you will develop mental illness later in life goes way up. Health issues goes way up.
There was a study done on it.
There's dozens.
The ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, right? That the higher score on that scale, so the more childhood trauma you have, the more likelihood of health issues and everything else you mentioned.
Well, and poverty's childhood trauma.
It's a big one.
And that, to me, is one of the most logical ones that people can kind of be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And it's really what it comes down to is a lack of resources. If I grow up in an environment where the resources are extremely limited, the ability for me to deal with what I'm dealing with is very limited, that is going to affect how my body responds and deals with all of the stuff that I have to deal with.
Right.
Additionally, imagine now that my resources for dealing with stuff, stress, overwhelm, trauma, just day-to-day life, and I'm experiencing crazy stuff here and there. Mom and dad are split up, or, I get beat up at school, or this crazy thing happens. I lose my best friend, whatever. All these things happen, right? And I have this cup that's overflowing. Can I learn new resources to deal with that? Abso-freaking-lutely.
Totally.
That's exactly what we're trying to teach. That's exactly what we're trying to help people understand, is that you can expand your resources. You can expand your capacity for dealing with stress. You can diversify the way that you deal with your life. And that's not something that takes, loads and loads and loads of effort. It takes regular, consistent, disciplined effort, but it's not this big, huge, giant undertaking that you need to be afraid of. It's something that is absolutely manageable.
Yeah.
And that's why First Watch was created in the first place, was so that we can help people earlier and get them the resources that they need to deal with the stuff that they've been through, that they will continue to go through, and so that they don't pass it down to the next generation. Because that's kind of really what we're learning about trauma now, especially, is this idea of generational trauma, that it goes down from this generation to the next, and there's this really important, there's this cool
Is it
term.
the bugs? Or,
What's that?
sorry, I was thinking the study of those bugs that they did for 6 generations of trauma.
No, tell me about that.
So I can't remember the exact bug that they used, or maybe it was a slug, some kind of insect, right? They're really easy to study because they have short lives, right? And so they did this study where they would inflict some sort of pain or discomfort onto these animals, and then of course the animals, these insects would breed, and they found that the stimulus to that response, so that certain pain, lasted all the way through up to 6 generations. So let's say it's a shock, right? The first generation they shock them, and then 6 generations later, the shock will still activate or trigger the 6th generation slugs. So trauma passes down through the generations.
Literally, in the actual DNA.
Yes.
But the person who decides to make a change and decides to deal with the shock,
Yep.
they are what we call a transitional character. There's actually a term for this in psychology, which is
interesting.
kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
And that transitional character, you can see a very clear delineation in their descendants that the behaviors don't continue, right? They're not going to jail. They're not as addicted. They're becoming more successful. They're happier. The levels of mental illness are going down when that one person decides to deal with it.
Yep. It has an impact.
It's a
And
big deal.
that's where there's a lot of hope, right? This is
There
what I
is.
try and teach my clients, is that you have the power to change these things and affect generations in the future. It's hard work.
It is.
But it's worth it.